Welcome back to the Movie Man. Today I will show you a 2000 adventure drama film, Castaway. Spoilers ahead. Watch out, and take care. The movie begins with a man named Chuck Noland, who works at one of the famous goods and services delivery companies, FedEx. Chuck is an exemplary employee and occupies a top position. He is very concerned about time discipline issues at the company. He always warns his subordinates to work with discipline and on time, because that is the goal of the shipping company. Coupled with the booming of shipments at that time, because before Christmas, on Christmas Eve, Chuck gathered with his family and also his girlfriend named Kelly. In the middle of the dinner, Chuck received news that he had to go to Malaysia for a job. Chuck was forced to leave the dinner and said goodbye to Kelly. Chuck also said that he would be back on New Year's Eve. Kelly then drove her lover to the airport. Before leaving, they had exchanged Christmas gifts. Kelly gave Chuck his family's antique pendant clock with a photo of him on it, while Chuck gave Kelly a small present that had to be opened on New Year's Eve. They split up, and the plane that Chuck was traveling on took off for Malaysia. On that flight, Chuck fell asleep because he was tired and it was already night. A moment later, Chuck woke up and took the watch locket Kelly gave him. Chuck then headed to the cockpit, and it turned out that there was a little commotion there. It happened because of a storm cloud, so they had to be able to avoid it so that the plane was safely airborne. That's why the plane had to change the route it was supposed to. Chuck, who heard it, suddenly panicked and went straight to the toilet to wash his face and tried to calm down. When Chuck was in the toilet, the plane suddenly experienced very strong turbulence. It was so fast that it made him bounce. Luckily, Chuck managed to get to his seat and put on a mask and seat belt. The pilot also provided life jackets and an emergency rubber boat. He also said that the plane would make an emergency landing on the water. The atmosphere in the plane was so panicked and terrible at that time. As a result, Chuck bounced again. Fortunately, the pilot managed to control the plane again, but the plane had to make an emergency landing over the ocean immediately. Due to the hard impact when landing, the plane split open, followed by a huge explosion. Slowly the plane began to sink, while Chuck, who was still trying to get out of the wreckage, was also sucked in by the body of the plane, which sank to the bottom of the ocean. Luckily, Chuck was able to rise to the surface and managed to open the rubber boat earlier. He was tossed around due to high waves. From afar he saw that the plane had disappeared into the ocean with the crew and pilot. Now he was left alone in the middle of the ocean, which was being hit by the storm. The rubber boat that was carrying Chuck was tossed around until finally stranded on an uninhabited island, around which there was only the ocean and a few packages scattered as a result of the incident the other day. Chuck also saved the packages in the hope that if he could survive, then he would deliver them to that address. In his despair, Chuck tried to stay sane by making a tent out of his rubber boat. For a time, Chuck could only stay silent while waiting for a passing ship to save him. The day changed. The next day, Chuck made the word "help" on the sand, hoping that someone would see it from above the passing plane. Unfortunately, the writing had to be washed away by the waves. The smart Chuck kept thinking while trying to find a way out. He then remade the help writing using the wood around him so the waves couldn't erase it. On the sidelines, Chuck still had time to collect some of the remaining packages and collect them. After days later, Chuck found coconuts that had fallen scattered. The funny thing was he didn't know how to open the coconuts. After trying several times, Chuck finally managed to open the coconut. He immediately drank the coconut water because he was thirsty. Then Chuck explored the island until he finally found a cave. Besides that, there was also a high cliff where he could see the surroundings of the island from above. When Chuck was at the top of the cliff, he saw an object floating in the sea. He immediately rushed to it, which turned out to be the corpse of the pilot. Chuck took him to the mainland, and then he took the shoes and flashlight from the pilot's body, after which he immediately buried it. And not to forget, Chuck also wrote his name on a big rock. Chuck spends his days hunting anything that can be used as food. Most often he looks for fish in the sea. It seems Chuck is now getting used to his new life. As night fell, Chuck could only stare at the watch pendant that his friend had given him. In his heart he hoped that he could get out of the island and marry her soon. Like and subscribe may look simple for you, but for us, it's precious. Please like, subscribe, and press the bell icon for the latest notifications. Thank you for being so supportive. That night when Chuck peed on the beach, he saw a light in the middle of the ocean that looked like a ship. He immediately took a flashlight to give the code, but his efforts were in vain. The next morning Chuck still saw the light, so he quickly sailed his rubber boat to ask for help. Chuck rowed the boat with enthusiasm, but unfortunately, the waves didn't allow it. Chuck was swept away by a big wave so that his feet hit sharp rocks. That made him sad, and now Chuck can only limp to the island again. The misfortune doesn't stop there. That night there is a very strong storm that makes Chuck have to sleep in the cave he found earlier. When he wakes up the next morning, Chuck decides to open one of the packages. The contents of the package vary, ranging from a document, volleyball, and dresses to ice skating shoes. Chuck uses the ice skating shoes as a cutting tool. He now realizes he has to build a bonfire so he can grill the food he gets and not just eat it raw. Using makeshift tools, Chuck tries to make a fireplace, but unfortunately, he keeps failing. Even his hands had to be injured as a result of continuing to swipe at the wooden branches. Feeling increasingly desperate, Chuck also vented his anger by throwing everything that was nearby. A few moments later Chuck tried to calm down. He then went to the beach to wash his wound. Chad intends to start another fire but is distracted by the volleyball, which still has blood on it. From the blood stains, Chuck painted the ball, which formed like a human face, pretending that it was his friend. He then tried to make fire again, and this time it seemed successful. Finally, Chuck felt so happy, to the extent that he made a very big bonfire. He celebrated his success by dancing. Chuck then burned the crabs he hunted. This time he enjoyed his food. The funny thing is, Chuck names the volleyball Wilson, and Chuck makes Wilson his soulmate. Chuck reveals that the search team will never find him, because they are only looking according to the route of the plane, while they do not know that the cargo plane has changed its route due to bad weather. Chuck spends his day with Wilson. He also draws all his wishes in the cave. Days change to months, and months turn to years until it doesn't feel like Chuck has been on the isolated island for 4 years. Even Chuck's appearance has now changed 180 degrees. He is like a primitive person. The next day when Chuck emerges from the cave, he finds a fiber toilet floating on the beach. For a moment Chuck could only stare at the toilet's fiber wall. The fiber finally fell down in the wind. Chuck thought that the fiber could be used as a boat sail. Chuck immediately gathered materials to make a raft. Chuck collects all available materials around him, such as logs, ropes from tree shavings, and so on. After so many days, Chuck finally succeeded in making his raft boat. Chuck waited for the right moment for him to go by determining the wind direction first. After everything was ready, then Chuck went using his homemade raft, leaving the isolated island he had lived on for the past 4 years. Not forgetting that Chuck also brought Wilson the volleyball, who he already considers his soulmate. To go out to sea is not an easy thing for Chuck and his boat. He has to face big waves and strong winds. With all his strength, Chuck kept rowing his raft. A big storm came unexpectedly. Chuck and his boat were tossed about by the storm so that the raft fell apart. The storm was so ferocious that Chuck fell limp and fell asleep on the remains of his raft. Without realizing it, Wilson had been swept away by the waves. Realizing this, Chuck immediately chased after his favorite volleyball, but the wave was strong enough to make Wilson carry it further into the middle of the ocean. Finally, with a heavy heart and very sad, Chuck let his soulmate go. Chuck cried uncontrollably. He mourned the departure of Wilson the volleyball. Due to exhaustion, Chuck fell asleep. For days Chuck drifted in the middle of the vast ocean, burned by the sun and without eating anything. Luckily a cargo ship passed nearby. With the remaining energy Chuck tried to ask the crew for help. Thank God the crew saw this and immediately evacuated him. 4 weeks later, Chuck was safely back home. Chuck has returned to life with a different appearance. At the welcoming ceremony, Chuck finds a large crab dish on the table and also a match so that it reminds him of his previous stranded experience. Chuck remembers the hard time when he was stranded on an isolated island for about 4 years, where he found everything very difficult. Chuck also prefers to sleep on the floor rather than on a comfortable bed. In his mind, Chuck still can't believe that he survived and has returned to his home. One night Chuck went to Kelly's house. his girlfriend whom he had not seen for a very long time. Kelly also welcomed Chuck warmly and longingly, but unfortunately, Chuck realized that Kelly had married someone else and had a daughter. There was a feeling of regret in Chuck. He said that he should not have gone that night. Kelly tried to strengthen him, and while saying that he still kept the car he gave him first, Chuck realized that he had to get out of there, and Kelly took him to the garage while kissing Chuck tenderly. After saying goodbye, Kelly couldn't hide her feelings, so she ran after Chuck's car in the pouring rain. Chuck came back and they said goodbye again for the last time. They hugged and kissed tightly. They also realized that they could not be reunited again. That was all of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.